When Edmund Burke declared that society is a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born, he articulated perhaps the most revolutionary idea in political philosophy, that wisdom belongs not to the present moment, but to the accumulated experience of humanity across generations. Yet in our age of perpetual innovation and radical egalitarianism, we treat our ancestors as ignorant primitives whose insights merit no consideration. This represents not progress, but a catastrophic severing from the sources of civilized order. Through my decades of study in Mikasta, examining the Anglo-American conservative tradition that flows from Burke through Adams to our present crisis, I've discovered that tradition represents not the tyranny of the past, but the democracy of the dead, a profound truth that offers our only hope against the ideological chaos consuming modern civilization. Today, we'll explore why this Burkean insight stands as the cornerstone of all genuine conservative thought, and why understanding tradition as democracy means the difference between civilized order and barbarian destruction. For in rejecting the counsel of our forebears, we commit the ultimate act of arrogance, presuming that our brief moment contains more wisdom than all preceding ages combined. Chapter 1: The Philosophical Foundation of Burkean Tradition. Burke's conception of tradition as democracy emerges from his understanding that human reason, operating in isolation from historical experience, proves fatally defective. When the French revolutionaries proclaimed the sovereignty of abstract reason over inherited institutions, they committed what I recognize as the cardinal error of modern radicalism, the belief that human intelligence, operating from first principles, can construct perfect social arrangements. Burke witnessed this hubris produce the terror, demonstrating that reason divorced from tradition becomes not enlightenment, but systematic madness. The democracy of the dead operates through what Burke called the wisdom of the species. Individual human beings, however brilliant, possess limited perspective bounded by their historical moment and personal experience. But tradition represents the collective intelligence of humanity tested through countless generations, refined by the crucible of actual experience rather than theoretical speculation. When we consult this accumulated wisdom, we participate in a form of democracy far more comprehensive than any contemporary political arrangement. This Burkean insight shaped my understanding during those formative years developing the conservative mind's foundations. Burke recognized that human nature itself remains constant across historical epochs, the same passions, the same follies, the same aspirations that drove ancient Rome also drive modern America. Therefore, the solutions discovered by previous generations retain their validity, not despite historical change, but because underlying human realities persist beneath surface transformations. The dead possess voting rights in this democracy because they have completed the experiment of living. They know which institutions promote human flourishing and which produce misery, which customs strengthen social bonds and which destroy them, which principles sustain civilization and which invite barbarism. Their testimony, preserved in law, literature, and social custom, offers guidance unavailable to any single generation operating from its limited perspective. Consider the American constitutional framework. The Founding Fathers didn't invent these arrangements from pure reason, but drew upon centuries of Anglo-Saxon legal development, classical political theory, and Christian moral insight. They consulted the democracy of the dead, learning from the successes and failures of previous attempts at ordered liberty. The result was not perfect, but it was wise, wisdom earned through generations of struggle rather than theoretical abstraction. Modern democracy, by contrast, recognizes only the living as legitimate participants in social decisions. This produces what Burke feared most, the tyranny of the present moment, where contemporary prejudices and fashions override the tested wisdom of ages. We see this disaster unfolding in contemporary America, where each generation presumes to reinvent social arrangements, discarding inherited wisdom as obsolete prejudice. Chapter 2: The Moral Imagination and Inherited Wisdom. Burke understood that tradition operates not merely through rational transmission of practical knowledge, but through what I call the moral imagination, the capacity to perceive transcendent order embodied in inherited forms and customs. The democracy of the dead speaks to us not only through explicit teachings, but through the accumulated symbols, rituals, and stories that shape our deepest understanding of human nature and social obligation. This imaginative dimension distinguishes living tradition from mere antiquarianism. The antiquarian collects historical artifacts as curiosities, but the conservative inherits living wisdom that continues shaping character and community. When we participate in traditional ceremonies, read classical literature, or follow customary practices, we engage in ongoing conversation with our ancestors, allowing their insights to inform our moral imagination. During my years exploring the conservative mind's development, I discovered that Burke's defense of tradition rested fundamentally on this imaginative understanding. He recognized that human beings require not merely rational arguments, but stories, symbols, and ceremonies that connect them to purposes larger than individual desire. Tradition provides this imaginative infrastructure, offering models of noble character, examples of virtuous action, and visions of transcendent order that purely rational discourse cannot supply. The French Revolution failed precisely because it attempted to construct society on purely rational foundations, stripping away the imaginative elements that make social life meaningful. When revolutionaries renamed months, abolished traditional festivals, and attempted to create rational religion, they discovered that human beings cannot flourish in arrangements that speak only to abstract reason while ignoring the moral imagination that tradition nourishes. Consider how traditional marriage ceremonies illustrate this principle. These rituals don't merely establish legal contracts, but invoke ancestral wisdom about human love, family obligation, and social continuity. They connect individual choices to cosmic order, temporal commitment to eternal purposes. When contemporary culture reduces marriage to temporary partnership based on personal satisfaction, it severs these imaginative connections, producing the social chaos we witness today. The democracy of the dead operates through such symbolic inheritance. When we read Shakespeare, we receive insights about human nature discovered through centuries of dramatic tradition. When we follow constitutional procedures, we participate in legal wisdom developed through generations of political experience. When we practice traditional virtues, we benefit from moral discoveries made by countless ancestors who learned through struggle what promotes human flourishing. This imaginative transmission explains why tradition cannot be replaced by explicit instruction. We cannot simply write down all traditional wisdom and expect it to function effectively. The moral imagination requires ongoing participation in inherited forms, sustained engagement with ancestral symbols, and living relationship with the community of the dead. Abstract knowledge lacks the power to shape character that comes from imaginative participation in traditional life. Modern education's failure stems largely from its abandonment of this imaginative inheritance. Contemporary schools attempt to transmit information without engaging the moral imagination that tradition provides. Students learn facts but lose the capacity for wisdom, acquire techniques but remain ignorant of purposes, master skills but cannot distinguish noble from base applications. Chapter 3: Tradition as Accumulated Prudence. The democracy of the dead operates through what Burke recognized as accumulated prudence, the practical wisdom earned through generations of trial and error, success and failure, in addressing the permanent problems of human existence. This represents perhaps the most crucial aspect of traditional authority, for it demonstrates that inherited customs embody not arbitrary preferences, but tested solutions to enduring challenges. Prudence, which I consider the supreme political virtue, emerges from experience rather than theory. Individual human beings, however intelligent, cannot anticipate all consequences of their actions or foresee all complications arising from seemingly rational arrangements. But tradition preserves the accumulated experience of countless generations who actually lived through these consequences, discovered these complications, and developed practical responses that proved effective over time. Consider the development of common law, which Burke championed against revolutionary attempts to construct legal systems from abstract principles. Common law represents democracy of the dead in its purest form, each generation of judges and lawyers adding their discoveries to accumulated legal wisdom, refining and developing inherited principles through actual application to concrete cases. The result is not perfect, but it is prudent, embodying more practical wisdom than any single generation could devise. This accumulated prudence explains why traditional institutions often function better than rationally designed alternatives, even when we cannot fully explain their effectiveness. Take the traditional family structure, which modern reformers constantly attack as arbitrary and oppressive. Yet this arrangement has sustained human societies across vastly different historical contexts, proving its effectiveness in meeting fundamental human needs for security, affection, moral formation, and cultural transmission. The democracy of the dead has voted overwhelmingly for this institution through their sustained practice across millennia. My own engagement with this principle deepened through studying the Anglo-American constitutional tradition. The American founders didn't attempt to create perfect government through pure reason, but adapted inherited British constitutional practices to American circumstances. They consulted the democracy of the dead, learning from centuries of English struggle between liberty and authority, discovering through traditional experience how to balance competing claims of order and freedom. The prudential character of tradition becomes especially evident in moral and social customs that seem inexplicable to contemporary reason but prove their worth through sustained practice. Many traditional restrictions that modern liberation considers arbitrary actually serve crucial functions in maintaining social order and individual character. The accumulated prudence of ancestors who lived through the consequences of various arrangements provides guidance unavailable to theoretical speculation. This doesn't mean tradition is infallible or unchangeable. Burke himself supported prudent reform when circumstances genuinely required adaptation. But such changes should emerge from careful study of traditional wisdom rather than wholesale rejection of inherited arrangements. The democracy of the dead counsels caution about innovation, not because change is inherently evil, but because the costs of abandoning proven solutions often exceed the benefits of untested alternatives. Contemporary progressivism commits the fatal error of treating accumulated prudence as accumulated prejudice, dismissing traditional arrangements as products of ignorance rather than experience. This represents not wisdom but hubris, the presumption that our particular historical moment contains more insight than all previous ages combined. The result is predictable. We repeat errors that our ancestors already solved, rediscover problems they already addressed, and abandon solutions that actually worked in favor of theories that sound enlightened but prove destructive in practice. Chapter 4: The Transcendent Foundation of Traditional Authority. Burke's defense of tradition rests ultimately on his understanding that human social order reflects and participates in divine order, that the democracy of the dead derives its authority not merely from accumulated human experience, but from its connection to transcendent truth that governs both temporal and eternal realms. This represents the deepest foundation of conservative thought, distinguishing it fundamentally from mere pragmatism or cultural relativism. When Burke declared that society is a partnership between living, dead, and unborn, he implied that human community participates in purposes larger than any single generation can comprehend. The democracy of the dead possesses authority because it connects us to this transcendent order, preserving insights about human nature and social obligation that emerge from humanity's ongoing relationship with divine truth. This transcendent dimension explains why traditional wisdom often contradicts contemporary fashions yet proves more reliable than current opinion. Human societies that align themselves with transcendent order, through traditional religion, classical virtue, and inherited institutions, demonstrate greater stability and produce higher forms of human flourishing than arrangements based solely on human will or contemporary preference. My decades of study in conservative foundations revealed that this transcendent grounding distinguishes genuine tradition from mere custom or habit. Living tradition connects human practices to eternal purposes, temporal arrangements to cosmic order, particular communities to universal principles. When we participate in such tradition, we engage not merely with human opinion, but with truths that transcend any historical moment. Consider how traditional religious practices illustrate this principle. These arrangements don't represent arbitrary human inventions, but responses to divine reality that transcends cultural and historical boundaries. When contemporary culture abandons traditional religious forms in favor of personalized spirituality or secular substitutes, it severs connection to transcendent order that traditional communities maintained across centuries. The authority of the dead emerges from their completed participation in this transcendent relationship. Having lived through the full cycle of human existence, they possess perspective unavailable to the living who remain caught in temporal concerns and immediate pressures. Their testimony, preserved in traditional institutions and customs, offers guidance grounded in ultimate rather than merely practical considerations. This transcendent foundation also explains why tradition possesses moral authority beyond mere utility. Traditional arrangements often require individual sacrifice for communal good, present duty over immediate pleasure, eternal purposes over temporal satisfaction. Such demands make sense only if tradition connects us to transcendent order that gives ultimate meaning to temporal existence. Burke recognized that revolutionary attempts to construct society on purely human foundations inevitably produce tyranny, because they acknowledge no authority higher than human will. Without transcendent grounding, political power becomes mere force, social arrangements become arbitrary preferences, and individual resistance becomes impossible to justify. The democracy of the dead provides alternative authority rooted in transcendent order rather than contemporary power. This doesn't mean that tradition is identical with divine revelation or that all inherited customs possess equal authority. But it does mean that genuine tradition participates in transcendent truth, preserving insights about human nature and social order that emerge from humanity's ongoing relationship with ultimate reality. When we consult the democracy of the dead, we engage not merely with human opinion, but with accumulated wisdom about transcendent purposes that govern human existence. Modern secularism commits the fundamental error of severing tradition from its transcendent foundation, reducing inherited wisdom to mere cultural preference or historical accident. This produces the relativism and nihilism that characterize contemporary culture, where no arrangement possesses authority beyond current opinion and every innovation appears equally valid. Chapter 5: Diversity within Unity, the Organic Nature of Tradition. The democracy of the dead operates not through mechanical uniformity, but through organic diversity that preserves essential unity while allowing for natural variation and prudent adaptation. This represents one of Burke's most profound insights, that genuine tradition exhibits the characteristics of living organisms rather than artificial machines, growing and developing while maintaining essential identity across historical change. During my exploration of conservative principles, I discovered that this organic understanding distinguishes authentic traditionalism from rigid reactionary thinking. Burke never advocated mindless preservation of all existing arrangements, but rather the prudent cultivation of living tradition that maintains essential character while adapting to legitimate circumstances. Like a healthy tree that grows new branches while strengthening its roots, tradition develops through time without losing its fundamental nature. This organic character explains why different societies can participate in the same essential tradition while expressing it through varying cultural forms. Anglo-American constitutional liberty, for instance, has developed differently in Britain and America, yet both expressions preserve the fundamental insights about ordered freedom that constitute this tradition's essential character. The democracy of the dead speaks through multiple voices, offering diverse testimonies about common truths. Consider how traditional marriage customs illustrate this principle. Different cultures have developed varying ceremonial forms, legal arrangements, and social expectations around marriage, yet these diverse expressions typically preserve common insights about human love, family obligation, and social continuity. The accumulated wisdom of the dead regarding marriage transcends particular cultural expressions while requiring some form of cultural embodiment to remain effective. This diversity within unity also appears in religious tradition, where different denominations and theological schools contribute varying perspectives to common spiritual insights. The democracy of the dead includes saints and sages from multiple traditions who discovered different aspects of transcendent truth, yet their testimonies complement rather than contradict each other when understood within the framework of perennial wisdom. The organic nature of tradition creates space for individual vocation within inherited structures. Rather than demanding mechanical conformity, living tradition recognizes that different persons contribute different gifts to the common good, that various temperaments require different expressions of common principles, that diverse talents serve unified purposes through complementary rather than identical activities. This understanding guided my own development as a conservative thinker. Rather than simply repeating inherited formulas, I sought to apply traditional insights to contemporary circumstances, contributing my particular perspective to the ongoing conversation between living and dead. The democracy of the dead doesn't demand slavish imitation, but thoughtful participation in inherited wisdom. Burke's defense of social hierarchy emerges from this organic understanding. Traditional societies exhibit natural diversity in talents, responsibilities, and social positions, not because of arbitrary oppression, but because complex societies require specialized functions and different forms of service. The democracy of the dead has discovered that attempts to impose artificial equality typically destroy the organic diversity that allows communities to flourish. Modern egalitarianism commits the error of confusing unity with uniformity, diversity with inequality. It attempts to create mechanical sameness that violates the organic character of human community, producing the social chaos we witness in contemporary attempts to eliminate all traditional distinctions. The result is not genuine equality but the tyranny of enforced conformity to current ideological preferences. The organic nature of tradition also explains why it cannot be artificially manufactured or rationally constructed. Like biological organisms, traditions must grow through time, developing through countless small adaptations and accumulated discoveries. Revolutionary attempts to create instant tradition typically produce artificial forms that lack the accumulated wisdom and organic complexity of authentic inherited arrangements. This organic understanding provides the key to distinguishing between prudent reform and destructive innovation. Changes that strengthen tradition's essential character while adapting to legitimate circumstances represent healthy development, while changes that violate fundamental principles or sever connection to inherited wisdom represent disease and corruption. Chapter 6: Prudence versus Ideology in Preserving Tradition. The democracy of the dead counsels political prudence against ideological radicalism, offering accumulated wisdom about the art of preserving essential order while allowing necessary change. This distinction between prudential politics and ideological thinking represents perhaps the most crucial practical application of Burkean traditionalism, providing guidance for navigating the eternal tension between stability and adaptation. Burke's opposition to the French Revolution emerged not from blind attachment to existing arrangements, but from prudential judgment about the catastrophic consequences of attempting revolutionary transformation based on abstract theory. The revolutionaries committed the fundamental error of ideological thinking, believing that human reason, operating from first principles, could construct perfect social arrangements without reference to historical experience or traditional wisdom. Through my decades studying the conservative mind's development, I've observed that this same pattern repeats throughout modern history. Ideological movements, whether revolutionary socialist, fascist, or contemporary progressive, share the common characteristic of rejecting the democracy of the dead in favor of supposedly rational schemes for human betterment. They treat traditional arrangements as obstacles to enlightenment rather than repositories of accumulated wisdom. Prudential politics operates differently. It recognizes that human nature remains constant across historical epochs, that social arrangements must accommodate enduring realities rather than utopian aspirations, that successful reform builds upon existing foundations rather than attempting complete reconstruction. The democracy of the dead provides invaluable guidance for such prudential thinking, offering testimony about which changes strengthen traditional order and which threaten essential stability. Consider how the American founding exemplifies prudential rather than ideological approach to political change. The founders didn't attempt to create perfect government from pure reason, but adapted inherited British constitutional practices to American circumstances. They consulted the democracy of the dead extensively, learning from classical political theory, English legal tradition, and Christian moral insight. Even their revolutionary separation from Britain was justified through appeal to traditional English rights rather than abstract philosophical principles. This prudential character distinguished the American Revolution from the French Revolution that followed, where Americans sought to preserve inherited liberties against contemporary encroachment. French revolutionaries attempted to reconstruct society according to rational theory. The contrasting results, American constitutional stability versus French revolutionary chaos, demonstrate the practical superiority of consulting rather than rejecting the democracy of the dead. Ideological thinking exhibits several characteristic errors that prudential politics avoids. First, it treats complex social realities as simple problems admitting rational solutions. Second, it ignores unintended consequences by focusing on intended effects. Third, it discounts human nature's permanent characteristics while overestimating the possibility of fundamental transformation. Fourth, it substitutes theoretical consistency for practical effectiveness. The democracy of the dead offers correctives to each of these errors. Traditional wisdom recognizes social complexity, anticipates unintended consequences through accumulated experience, accommodates permanent human characteristics, and prioritizes what works over what sounds theoretically appealing. This doesn't mean tradition is infallible, but it does mean that proposed changes should be tested against traditional experience rather than abstract theory. Contemporary America suffers from the triumph of ideological over prudential thinking. Progressive movements treat traditional arrangements as arbitrary obstacles to rational progress. Conservative movements sometimes respond with equally ideological reaction, and both sides abandon the prudential consultation with inherited wisdom that could provide genuine solutions. The result is political polarization that serves ideological consistency rather than practical governance. The path forward requires recovering Burke's prudential approach, defending traditional insights while remaining open to necessary adaptation, consulting the democracy of the dead while addressing contemporary circumstances, preserving essential principles while allowing organic development. This represents not compromise but wisdom, the accumulated prudence of generations who learned through experience how to balance stability with change. Such prudential politics requires intellectual humility, recognition that our particular historical moment contains limited perspective, that inherited arrangements often embody wisdom we don't fully understand, that the democracy of the dead deserves respectful consultation rather than arrogant dismissal. Chapter 7: The Permanent Things and the Democracy of the Dead. The democracy of the dead ultimately serves to preserve and transmit what I call the permanent things, those transcendent truths about human nature, moral order, and social obligation that remain constant across historical change and provide the foundation for all genuine civilization. This represents the deepest purpose of tradition, distinguishing it from mere conservatism of convenience or nostalgic attachment to familiar arrangements. Burke's insight about tradition as partnership between living, dead, and unborn points toward these permanent realities that transcend any particular historical moment. The dead possess authority in this democracy not merely because of their temporal priority, but because their completed experience provides testimony about eternal truths that govern human existence across all epochs and cultures. During my years developing conservative thought, I came to understand that these permanent things include the reality of transcendent order that gives meaning to human existence, the necessity of moral law that distinguishes right from wrong, the importance of individual human dignity balanced with social obligation, the requirement of ordered liberty that protects genuine freedom while maintaining civilized restraint, and the value of cultural continuity that connects each generation to its inheritance while preparing for future transmission. The democracy of the dead serves these permanent things by preserving institutional arrangements, cultural practices, and intellectual traditions that embody and transmit transcendent insights across generations. When we consult inherited wisdom, we engage not merely with human opinion, but with accumulated discoveries about permanent realities that govern human flourishing. Consider how traditional educational practices illustrate this function. Classical liberal education, with its emphasis on great books, moral formation, and cultural transmission, doesn't represent arbitrary academic preference, but tested methods for initiating each generation into the permanent things that constitute civilized life. When contemporary education abandons these traditional forms, it severs connection to the permanent things that make human existence meaningful. The permanent character of these realities explains why traditional wisdom often contradicts contemporary fashion yet proves more reliable over time. Human societies that align themselves with permanent things demonstrate greater stability and produce higher forms of human development than arrangements based on temporary theories or current preferences. The democracy of the dead has voted consistently for these permanent realities through sustained practice across diverse historical contexts. This doesn't mean that all traditional arrangements possess equal validity or that change is inherently wrong. But it does mean that legitimate innovation must serve rather than violate the permanent things, that successful adaptation must strengthen rather than weaken connection to transcendent order, that prudent reform must preserve rather than abandon the essential insights that tradition embodies. Modern radicalism commits the fundamental error of treating the permanent things as historical accidents or cultural constructions rather than transcendent realities. This produces the relativism and nihilism that characterize contemporary culture, where every arrangement appears equally valid and no tradition possesses authority beyond current opinion. The path to cultural renewal requires recovering connection to the permanent things through renewed consultation with the democracy of the dead. This means taking seriously the accumulated wisdom of our ancestors, studying traditional texts and practices with respectful attention, and seeking to understand rather than dismiss inherited arrangements that have sustained human societies across centuries. Such recovery doesn't require uncritical acceptance of all traditional forms, but it does require intellectual humility about the limitations of contemporary perspective and respect for the accumulated experience of humanity. The democracy of the dead offers invaluable guidance for addressing contemporary challenges while remaining grounded in permanent realities that transcend historical change. Individual responsibility in this democratic process involves both receiving inherited wisdom and contributing to its ongoing transmission. Each generation participates in conversation between living and dead, adding its discoveries to accumulated tradition while preserving essential insights for future generations. We serve as temporary custodians of permanent things, responsible for faithful transmission of transcendent truths that constitute the foundation of civilized life. The stakes in this cultural conversation could not be higher. Societies that maintain connection to permanent things through respect for the democracy of the dead preserve the possibility of human flourishing, while societies that sever these connections invite the barbarism that inevitably follows when civilization loses its foundations. Conclusion. Burke's profound insight about tradition as democracy of the dead offers our best hope for navigating contemporary cultural chaos while preserving the foundations of civilized order. When we understand inherited wisdom not as arbitrary constraint but as accumulated prudence, not as dead weight but as living guidance, we discover resources for addressing modern challenges that purely contemporary thinking cannot provide. The democracy of the dead operates through moral imagination, accumulated prudence, transcendent foundation, organic diversity, political prudence, and service to permanent things, offering comprehensive alternative to the ideological thinking that threatens to destroy Western civilization. Yet this democratic consultation requires intellectual humility, respectful attention to inherited wisdom, and commitment to transmitting rather than merely consuming traditional insights. Each generation faces the choice between proud autonomy that rejects ancestral counsel and humble participation in the ongoing conversation between living and dead. The permanent things endure regardless of our contemporary choices, but our civilization's connection to them depends entirely on our willingness to listen respectfully to the accumulated wisdom of humanity. In consulting the democracy of the dead, we discover not limitation but liberation, freedom grounded in transcendent order rather than arbitrary will, wisdom tested through generations rather than theoretical speculation, and hope based on permanent realities rather than temporary fashions.